All right, let's get some analysis on this. Joining me now is political analyst Joseph Ochieno, he joins me now live from Uganda. Thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World. So you heard what Momin is saying. Basically, despite the ceasefire, fighting continues. And this comes in the wake of a stark warning by Washington that whoever violates the ceasefire will be sanctioned. So this is what I'm able to make out of the latest situation. Basically, the warring sides in Sudan do not care about being sanctioned by Washington.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Even up to late last night, I was one of those people who were quite optimistic that this time around, particularly because of the nature of the agreement and the nature of the implications in terms of the monitoring arrangements put in place, that both sides would hopefully respect it. But as you rightly say, quite clearly, it would appear that that is not happening. The RFCU is really in their interest not to be the bad guys of Sudan, considering their track record and considering some of the things that they're doing. You know that in the event that actually one side loses, and in this case it's the RFCU, it would be the case that many of these guys would be substantially in trouble. But the problem, though, is this, that it would appear that these guys are confident because, one, they've got military strength, because they've got this rather ruthless history in recent times in the Sudan, spoiled by al-Bashir, but also substantially backed by the Emiratis, and in this case, I think some of the Libyans, plus many other forces, So surprisingly, they've got sympathies around the world, and maybe beyond Sudan, beyond Saudi Arabia and the US, we might also need to begin to list who is who in backing these guys. I happen to know that some of their representatives were within the region. I'm not quite sure whether it's safe to mention some of the leaders that some of their representatives were visiting within the sub-region, which may be fueling this, and it's a very worrying thing indeed. But on the other, the hope is that once the Saudis actually put their feet and the US put their feet on the ground and simply say that, well, this thing settlement needs to take place, it is hopeful that it was hopeful that this would be the beginning of a process which would be an end.
But clearly, Joseph, that is not the case. Despite stark warnings from Washington, fighting still continues. And frankly, as we spoke, it appears that the warring generals do not care about being sanctioned by Washington. Is that perhaps an indication that the two warring sides in Sudan do not look at the US as a possible peacemaker in the region?
It's possibly less about that, but more about the stakes which are at place. I think for the rebels, as your correspondent in Sudan seems to suggest, they really want a winner takes all. So perhaps they think that if they're able to capture that airbase, they might actually neutralize the Sudanese army. But between these two, I'm not quite sure whether war of attrition would be in any of their interests, because I don't think it's possible. But it would be actually having huge implications on the people of Sudan. So for that reason, I think it would be interesting what happens in the next 24 hours, that the US, having put the position that they put on, and the Saudis, meaning the brokers of this, what statement they come in and what sanctions, if any, they come up. But it's extremely important that this matter is escalated, that I think it cannot be allowed to continue beyond really where it is at the moment.
Joseph, I believe you have followed this conflict from the very beginning, and the fact that it's been more than 5 weeks and fighting still continues tells us that there are major disagreements between the warring sides. And in order for any settlement to be reached, first they have to reconcile their differences. So what do you think is acting as the biggest stumbling block when it comes to reconciling differences?
I think the breakdown of the relationship, once they toppled the civilian authorities and sought to work together, both sides quite clearly realized, particularly from the rebel sides, they realized that they have a relative capacity to be able to challenge and take on the Sudanese army. In fact, the fact that they actually dare to seek to want to overthrow their fellow military colleagues shows that they had a magnitude of confidence, partly because of the army, the armament, the arms that they have, but two, the rebels have got a huge amount of money, some of which are actually substantially illicitly obtained. So these are really two particular now men, you can call it, who have got huge egos, and I'm not quite sure whether it's very much about, how they look at the rest of the world, but rather what they consider is a stake for themselves. I think it's basically like spoiled children, but except, unfortunately, the spoiled children who are substantially armed, substantially equipped, substantially resourced. And on this occasion, I think they're boxing themselves in a corner, particularly for the rebel side, that they have no alternative, perhaps, but to fight on. But if I was advising them, I would say actually the best thing for them is to ceasefire and find a situation in which there is a settlement that, by and large, eventually leads to a civilian rule in Sudan. I know that's one of the things for which they are pathologically opposed to, but that's the reality in this region, that whether it happens today, tomorrow, perhaps in the next 5 years, it must happen.
All right, Joseph Ochieno, fascinating insights into the topic. Thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World.